Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
My goal tonight is not to persuade you that the way I respond to the question concerning faith in reason is the right one. There's in whole or even in part. There's no way I can do that in a brief presentation and in discussion. Instead, my goal is to share my perspective and then to have a conversation with you that joins a much larger conversation that has been going on for centuries. I'm thankful to Nathan for agreeing to join in, and I'm very eager to hear what he has to say in his response. Philosophers, curious creatures that we are, like to talk with thoughtful people who disagree with us. We seek them out. We care about the truth, and we know that our best chance at getting closer to the truth is to take advantage of the benefit of different perspectives and have a lot of back and forth. Philosophers have special training for thinking about this kind of question we're talking about tonight. And so I do think we have a useful role to play in the conversation, but we don't have a monopoly on wisdom. And for that reason, I'm also looking forward to the comments and questions that several of you will get the chance to contribute. I am a Christian, and I will be speaking tonight of Christian faith. While it is good and important in our society to promote harmony across peoples of various religious faiths and non-faith by noting the moral values that most of us share, there is only so much one can usefully say about the relationship between reason and faith generically. Jews, Muslims, Christians, monotheistic Hindus, and those of more eclectic private blend varieties of theistic faith face importantly distinct questions concerning evidence and goodness of fit with what science and history give us good reason to believe. The question I will discuss then is the fit between reason and Christian faith. In doing so, I will stick to the ecumenical intersection of traditional Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant expressions of Christian faith, what the scholar and popular writer C.S. Lewis called mere Christianity. Now, as a philosopher, again, I care most fundamentally about truth. I want to know the way reality is and conform my life to the facts, including the facts concerning what make for true human flourishing. So, at the end of the day, I want to ask whether there is good reason to think that Christianity, in its fundamentals, is an accurate depiction of reality and of the path to human flourishing. But before addressing that question head on, I want to call into doubt some assumptions that many of us bring to this question. Philosophers are annoying. One of the ways that we annoy is by complicating seemingly simple questions. We don't come to our discussion tonight as blank slates, right? We've all been heavily shaped by the sense we've picked up somehow, and whether accurate or not, of the general drift of opinion among the cognitive elite, and also by our limited experience of religion, as an insider perhaps, or as an observer. We, religious and non-religious people alike, need to be on guard against biases that shape how we view the actual evidence. As a member of the cognitive elite, as a college professor, I can confidently tell you that we too have our own biases. So don't think you are getting the unvarnished truth by hearing what Nathan and I think on such complicated matters as reason and religion. What is more, the world is a very big place, and so is the worldwide Christian church. Generalizing about people's rationality in forming and maintaining their religious beliefs is bound to badly misrepresent the reality. So I will start then by asking three preliminary questions. First, in the ongoing historical discussion of Christian faith and reason in Western culture, how did we get where we are nowadays? And this is a good time for me to pause and ask, has my handout been distributed? Okay, good. Second, I will ask, what is this thing called reason? Right? You might think, well, we know the reason part, it's the faith part that's the funny business, but we need to think about reason itself. And then third, what is that other thing called faith as understood by Christians? After laying this foundation, I will point to the kind of factors that I see as pointing to the truth of the Christian revelation. I won't be suggesting that this or that proves the truth of Christianity. If you want proofs, stick to the math department. It's a question of how best to interpret the evidence on balance. As I see it, there's good reason on balance to believe that the basic claims of the Christian faith are true. However, unless you want to listen to me talk a lot longer than was announced, all I can do here really is to gesture at some factors that I find significant, then we can start to reason together. All right, so first question, how did we get where we are? This is a question that people don't ask generally, but should. Mark Twain quipped that faith is believing what you know ain't so. And we laugh. Why is it so common nowadays to think of faith and reason as at odds? One big reason is that we are all heavily influenced by a narrative telling us that there has been a long, continuous conflict or battle between the Christian religion and modern science. Many of your professors, perhaps some here tonight, fervently believe this story. But the fact of the matter is that it's a myth. What is true is that there has always been, within most Christian sub-traditions, a tension between those who are hyper-protective guardians of orthodoxy and those who promote the serious, fearless pursuit of learning. But the promoters of knowledge always have had the best theological argument. It goes like this: all of reality is the good creation of God, and we are made in his image. So we ought to use and cultivate the intellectual gifts we have been given. Not to do so would be to dishonor our generous Creator. The most famous and influential of the early church fathers, St. Augustine, said as much many centuries before Galileo, let alone Darwin. Few appreciate nowadays that much of the confidence in reasoned inquiry that fueled the scientific revolution in the 16th and 17th centuries stemmed from Christian belief in the wisdom of nature's wise author. Prominent Christian scientists took this to imply that the world would behave according to elegant, understandable principles. Francis Bacon famously spoke of God's two books, the book of God's works and the book of his word. Institutionally, the Catholic Church was the major funder of scientific inquiry from the late Middle Ages well into the 18th century. Individually, many of the greatest thinkers in science and philosophy have been devout Christians, from Bacon and Newton at the time of the scientific revolution to Francis Collins, head of the Human Genome Project, and Harvard astronomer Owen Gingerich today. There are many, many others I could cite, both important historical figures and contemporary. But have there not been flashpoints? Yes, of course there have. Galileo's and Darwin's insights are the most notorious. But these are, I claim, anomalies in a mostly peaceful, even mutually supportive coexistence. They are cases of religious authorities behaving stupidly, something, alas, not unheard of in the history of Christian communities. These reactions reflect the all-too-human pattern of defensive reaction to perceived threats, to received understanding, more than anything about the basic Christian view of reality. Moreover, the way even these cases played out is quite different from what many have supposed. A lot of myths have built up around these stories. Galileo was not tortured, and Darwin had many early Christian defenders, even among traditional Protestants. There's a nice book called Darwin's Forgotten Defenders. It's all about evangelical Christians who, very early post-Darwin, accepted and embraced Darwinian evolution. So where did the science-religion battle myth originate? It started with some of the 18th century Enlightenment critics of Christianity and was cemented in the polemical accounts of two deeply influential 19th century historians whom you've never heard of, and neither had I until I started reading in the history of science and religion. They go by their names are John William Draper, who was the author of a widely used textbook, college textbook, at a time when individual textbooks would get used quite widely across the United States, and Andrew Dixon White, who was the first president of Cornell. It endures, even though their claims have been thoroughly discredited by modern historians. Right? There's a whole field of history now called history of science and religion. Both secular and religious scholars will agree that this idea that there's been a continuous battle is a myth. There's some truth to the story, of course. There have been fights of various kinds waged over theological issues, but it has not been a continuous sort of battle. I can't cite all the major sources that one could go to here. I'll just recommend one helpful and accessible collection of recent essays by science religion historians, and it's on your handout. It's called Galileo Goes to Jail and Other Myths in Science and Religion. I also recommend you check out the very large online resource at biologos.org, which brings together scientists, philosophers, theologians, and others. I myself have contributed to that site, who are all Christians, traditionalist Christians of various stripes, who believe in the unity and integrity of science with all of science with Christian faith. Of course, the myth has been heavily fueled by the fact that some Christians, many Christians in the 20th century, right up to today, have set themselves against some important developments in science. This is unfortunate, but again, it says more about their skewed perspectives on the faith than the faith itself. All right, second question, what is reason? Let's start with the obvious. To reason well is to skillfully and effectively deploy the cognitive tools we've been given. For example, our 5 basic senses, our memory, abstract reasoning, methods of empirical theorizing, and handling the testimony of others. Here's what's less obvious. Doing these things requires a lot of trust. Many say reason looks for evidence while faith takes things on trust. But philosophers who are used to probing the foundations of human knowledge have long recognized that reason, too, is rooted in a kind of trust. We just can't get going in examining the world without trusting that the basic equipment that we have, the cognitive equipment that we have, is generally reliable. If I try to argue that my senses, for example, are reliable, I will have to use these very same capacities and so engage in a kind of circular reasoning. So if I ask you to verify that Nathan is sitting up front here, right, I say, well, I don't just have my own senses. You can tell me that my senses are reliable. If you tell me that, how do I know that you're perceiving the same thing? Through my senses. I hear you, I listen to you, I see you, right? So I'm not getting a wholly independent check on the accuracy of my senses. I can't. The point is simple. You got to start somewhere. And starting point is a name for something that you trust. So the question for us is not whether taking some things on trust is ever reasonable, since we can't do without it. The question instead is what and whom we trust, and whether our trust is appropriately critical and calibrated over time in response to evidence. In figuring this out, the wise course strikes a balance between learning to think critically for ourselves and taking advantage of the resources and corrective benefits of community. When you stop and think about it, you'll quickly realize that almost everything we know, every one of us, comes from what other people tell us. That's our main source of information. It's not our senses, it's not our reasoning, it's what people tell us. As infants, we learn language and acquire beliefs about our surroundings through what caregivers tell us, while having no capacity to independently verify their reliability. Later, as mature, educated adults, we continue to base much of what we know on social sources that gather, sift, organize, and ultimately transmit information to us as knowledge consumers. Natural and human history, geography and current affairs, science information and theories. It's nearly all rooted in what we're told, whether by word, textbook, or electronic media. The sciences are a collection of specialized and highly organized communities interpreting the book of nature as an integral system. They stick to intersubjective and empirical methods, and they focus on deep patterns and principles, not singular episodes. Together, they are a remarkable human achievement, perhaps our greatest human achievement of the last 400 or 500 years. But like all of human knowledge, they are inevitably trust-based. Indeed, given the hyper-specialized nature of science, most of what a scientist knows, even in her own specialty, is based on what she reads in scholarly journals, not what she herself has independently verified. All right, thus far I have argued first that science and Christian faith have not been deeply at odds historically, and second, that the proper use of reason involves calibrated forms of trust, exercised in community. Here's my third question. What is Christian faith? I'll just throw out how I understand it and then talk a bit about it. Christian faith, I take it, is reasoned trust in what we take to be God's self-revelation and promises to humankind. It is individual, but it is also pervasively mediated by the life of the Christian community as a whole. That is, we Christians take ourselves to have evidence that we are in a relationship with a being who is our creator, who cares deeply for us, and has communicated his love for us. At some point in our lives, we commit in trust, not unlike the way that a person commits to, goes all in on a relationship with another human person whose trustworthiness is indicated by evidence, but is not proved. The Christian community is engaged in a semi-organized, ongoing effort to interpret and respond to the book of God's Word, using our reasoning abilities, what we learn from the book of God's works, and our collective experience. Our belief, no less than our practice, is deeply communal. Christianity's religious text encompasses both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, where the latter controls our understanding of the former. They are not a set of simple instructions and creeds, but a very diverse set of writings, spanning centuries and cultures and employing a variety of genres that to this day are only incompletely understood. Attempting to interpret such writings requires a number of expert scholarly skills, and no individual scholar possesses sufficient skills to do so well for all these texts. Attempting to synthesize such knowledge so as to interpret the whole as a unified, progressive revelation requires yet further literary and theological skills. For most Christians, it also requires engaging the many centuries of attempts to do so, though Christians differ on the degree of authority the voices of the past should properly be accorded and their relative weighting. It also requires sensitivity to the way one's own culture shapes the way one approaches the text and one's willingness to hear specific emphases. I have met a Christian pastor who lives in a shanty on a vast garbage dump outside of Manila. He hears Jesus' teachings concerning wealth and poverty very differently than I, an American academic, do. Then there is the expertise of philosophers in assessing philosophical arguments for and against theism, or claims concerning miraculous events. The expertise of historians and archaeologists in evaluating evidence concerning important events described in the biblical narratives. And the multidisciplinary expertise needed to integrate what appears to be taught in Revelation and what we learn from outside Revelation through science and historical and social reflection. Truth is also disclosed, we think, by gifted writers, visual artists, composers, and performers, all of whom can disclose the beauty of the Christian vision of reality in distinctive ways. I could go on. Christians are part of a sprawling, multi-generational, multicultural faith community whose understanding of God and of God's ways is ever evolving. Depending on which denominational tradition one resides in, one will see more or less latitude for evolution, but it is present in some measure for all such sub-traditions. Every Christian is deeply dependent, knowingly or not, on a vast number of others for whatever measure of understanding they possess and for the objective plausibility of the faith they embrace. And as with the sciences, so too here, there is much more knowledge present within the community as a whole than what any one individual may hope to attain. Okay, that was the setup. We finally arrive at our target question. Is the Christian faith true? Why believe it? My answer to that is one of a 40-something professional philosopher. How 19-year-old college student Tim came to Christian faith from agnosticism is another matter, of course. Let me start there. I had a profound experience of conversion to the Christian faith as a college freshman at the University of Illinois. This came after several months of reflection and discussion and tentative explorations of Christian community. But in the end, my faith was quite unexpected to me. At some point, I shifted from reading the Gospels as stories about a remarkable man who lived long ago to taking him to be speaking to me right now through these texts. I would describe it as like when you're standing chest deep in calm ocean water facing the shoreline and you're suddenly hit from behind unexpectedly by a wave that throws you face first into the sand. There I was, wiped out on the shore, wiping sand from my face and asking myself, what the hell just happened, right? Seriously, that's sort of kind of how it was to me. I mean, I had a profound experience, and yet I had a lot of questions. This naturally led me to want to study philosophy, to try to sort it all out. And so the period of my Christian faith has coincided pretty much exactly with what turned into the lifelong study of philosophy. As I see it, each has benefited from the presence of the other in my life. So why do I now continue to believe it? C.S. Lewis, a popular Christian writer in the mid-20th century, once wrote, "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." And this image nicely captures a good part of my own attitude. Christianity offers us a comprehensive picture of reality, akin in certain ways to an ambitious, highly general scientific theory. It has the resources to draw together and explain a number of things outside the scope of science, and to do so in a way that is fully congruent with what lies inside the scope of science. I believe that when well articulated, it offers the best way we have to synthesize what we know of the central impersonal and personal aspects of the world we experience. Not everything we know of fits so well. Widespread, intense, unjust, and seemingly random human and animal suffering is hard to square with the existence of a benevolent and all-powerful creator. That too has to be weighed in the balance. And we can talk about what we might say about that in the discussion. But I will end my opening remarks by highlighting 6 major points that collectively I see as significant points in favor of Christianity. All right, and these are given on your handout. The first 3 points are ones in favor of monotheism, the claim that the world that we are part of finds its origin in a single creator who is unlimited in power and knowledge and goodness, and which creator is a personal being desiring relationships with human beings. Hence, these considerations are just as much forms of evidence for Judaism and Islam and other theistic religions as for Christianity. The place to look for evidence for God, I suggest, is not in the current gaps in scientific understanding. Religious people, of course, have always been tempted to do just that. But with the great medieval philosopher-theologian Thomas Aquinas, I believe in this context, we should think of God as the cause of causes. God is present everywhere, sustaining all things by his will. We find evidence for his existence instead at the inbuilt limits of science. I greatly respect the sciences, all of them, but there are certain truths too big for it to attempt to explain, and for which theism offers a natural explanation. The first of these is the simplest: there being anything at all for science to describe. The existence of our world is simply a given for science. Science's goal is to describe the structure and dynamics of what we observe in as compact and elegant a manner as possible. But why should there be a large and complicated world, and one specifically like ours? It doesn't seem to be at all necessary that this sort of world had to be, the way that 2 + 2 had to equal 4, come what may. There's a lot to say about this question. 5 years ago, I wrote an entire book devoted to it. I think that in the final analysis, the best thing one can say is that our contingent world is the product of a very different, more unified sort of reality, part of whose very nature it is to be. That doesn't entail that God exists, but it's a large step in that direction. The second thing that science is at least unlikely to be able to explain fully is the fundamental orderliness of the universe that we observe. Science necessarily has to use a limited body of data, seek to discern the simplest way to model that data, and then assume that the model applies to the vastly bigger range of unobserved cases. Lo and behold, the method works, and to a spectacular degree. It is easy not to notice the surprising nature of what is so familiar. It's really remarkable that using the methods that we do, that we can generalize from what is really a tiny bit of data in relation to the entirety of the cosmos, and be able to yield predictive models that work astonishingly well. Furthermore, contemporary physics has come to learn that our universe is remarkably fine-tuned for life, and hence for sentient human and other animal life that has great value. I can't go into the details of this, but physics presents a picture of our world as involving a number of fundamental features, things like particle ratios, the precise strength to an exquisitely precise degree of certain fundamental forces, nuclear forces, gravitational force, the gravitational constant, a variety of things that when they model the pictures of the unfolding of the universe, if you alter the details from the actual values, outside of any but a very tiny range of variability, it turns out the way the universe would have evolved would not have been hospitable to the development of life. I mean, basically, in almost every possible case, you either get things too rapidly expanding post-Big Bang, and so you just get an uninteresting kind of universe, a lot of, spare solitary particles, or gravitational force overwhelms the other forces and things just condense into an undifferentiated lump, right? It turns out that our universe has just what it takes for life to be able to come about. Does this show that theism is true? No, it's not a proof, right? The point is that it seems to provide some evidence in favor of theism. After all, if God exists, we shouldn't be very surprised that he would opt for a universe that has just what it takes to give rise to sentient, intelligent life. Mini creators, as it were. A third and final basic feature of our world that science cannot explain is the existence of value, and specifically the deep, objective, moral value of human persons, out of which flow the rights that we have as individuals and the responsibilities that we owe to each other. There can be no way to prove that persons have such value. Some deny it because they can't see how to fit it into what they assume to be a fundamentally impersonal and pointless physical reality. But their denial is purely theoretical. All of us, other than sociopaths, right, people who are really cognitively disturbed, take it as a given in practice that human persons have value, treat other persons as objects of value, right? Only a sociopath is completely indifferent to the value of other persons and is willing to treat them as a piece of trash. No one does that in practice, right? Furthermore, the reasoning of those who infer the non-existence of moral value is flawed. They're letting their metaphysics dictate their evidence, rather than inferring to a more adequate metaphysics from their evidence. We perceive the world as a place imbued with value, both the positive value of moral goodness and beauty and the negative value of injustice and undeserved suffering. We all palpably feel that in our encounters with the world. We look at other people through that lens. It's fundamental to the way that we are oriented to the world. The skeptic is correct. The skeptic about value is correct, I think, to think that genuine moral perception fits badly with a view on which physical reality is the full extent of concrete existence. One would have to simply accept an irreducible dualism of two realms, those of physical and moral facts. But that view is not indicated, let alone dictated, by the achievements of the sciences, which limit themselves purposefully to the physically detectable and measurable. Theism holds that physical reality is not ultimate reality. Ultimate reality is personal and creative. Moral value can be seen as a facet of God's being, not as some independent realm sitting astride it. It's simply a better fit. So far, I've pointed to the existence and orderliness of the physical world and the further fact of moral value as indicators of God's existence. I now want to talk about three factors pointing to the truth distinctively of the Christian revelation concerning God's nature and purposes vis-a-vis human beings. Okay, my first point encompasses three little subpoints. Three features of the human condition across time and culture. We are simultaneously animals. That's what we are. Yet we are also self-aware, morally free beings, capable of knowing remarkably a great deal about our world. 2, spiritual experiences of God or gods are pervasive in every known human culture, both contemporary and historically. Recent studies in cultural anthropology and evolutionary psychology of religion have also indicated that children are natural born or intuitive believers in God, that is disposed to form theistic beliefs as they mature, even in cultures whose developed religious doctrines are non-theistic, such as Buddhist cultures. 3, we humans exhibit a simultaneous moral wretchedness and nobility. This weird and disturbing schism has been expressed eloquently by many writers. particularly the Soviet dissident Solzhenitsyn, who wrote, "If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being." He wrote as somebody imprisoned in the Soviet gulags for many decades as a dissident of the regime, right? And he had to come to terms with the fact after reflection that it wasn't just that there were these evil people that were oppressing him, that the evil resided in him too. All of this fits well with Christianity, which teaches that we are made in God's image. We are icons of divine beauty and goodness, freedom and knowledge, and we are made for union with him. Yet there are crack lines running through us, urgently in need of repair and restoration. In this way, Christianity can affirm a robust yet balanced humanism, whereas modern secular thought, it seems to me, struggles between the poles of a rationalistic hubris that denies our limits, and on the one hand, and a denigration of human persons, especially those least able among us, as insignificant elements of a vast and purposeless reality on the other hand. A second matter Christian teaching helps to explain is much more specific: the remarkable life and death of Jesus of Nazareth within the Messianic Judaism of first century Palestine and his subsequent impact. By anyone's account, Jesus was an extraordinary person. A peasant who lived the first 30 years of his life in total obscurity, he appeared on the Jewish religious scene, and without precedent, he immediately began teaching on his own authority, not those of the learned rabbis who had gone before, not even the authority of Moses the lawgiver. He is a polarizing figure, beloved of many ordinary people, including those who are not up to par in religious observance, and increasingly hated by the religious leaders whom he confronts. The Gospels portray a man who brings together qualities usually seen as opposites: gentleness and authority, compassion and righteous denunciation. Jesus was probably the first feminist in human history. I can talk about that later. He speaks confidently of an intimate relationship with God, whom he addresses simply as Father. And as his final confrontation draws near, he indicates more openly that he believes himself to be divine. As he is put to death in gruesome fashion, he begs for mercy for his oppressors. Many of his followers immediately abandon him. Without obvious explanation, his body soon disappears. He had told his closest followers that he would be raised from the dead. Many witnesses say that they indeed saw and spoke to him subsequent to his death. They had nothing to gain and much to lose in making this profession, and indeed many of them died for it. Their lives are transformed by what they claim to be the encounter with the risen Christ. What does one make of all this? I can't begin to sort all this out now. Many issues are involved. My own take is that we have powerful evidence that something extraordinary happened after his death. Many secular historians agree with that. Where we go from there will depend on our background views. Whether God exists, the likelihood that he should desire to communicate to us, the intuitive plausibility of Jesus' message that we are in need of rescue and transformation. I judge that he was who he said he was. I trust him. Indeed, the confidence in my theistic belief is bolstered in part by the evidence that God has become incarnate and shared in our sufferings. It doesn't solve the intellectual problem of suffering, but it makes it easier to trust that God will ultimately redeem it, all of it, if he himself has shared in it. A final indicator of the truth of Christianity is the Christian church itself. In our culture right now, this sort of claim raises eyebrows, and I can see some raised eyebrows right now. But it is how I judge the matter, based on my reading about the church from its earliest days until now, and my own experience of Christian community. Let's start with the case against such a claim. There has been, and continues to be, much that is ugly in the Christian church. I believe this is commonly overstated, but that it has been true in significant measure is simple historical fact. At various times and places, assortments of villains in the church have organized some of the rest in appalling activities on scales large and small. But consider, when you think about that, consider that the sole factor that binds all Christians together is our response to the unqualified love of God. This love is extended not only to fine, pretty people such as you and me, but also to the willfully ignorant, the annoying, the crazy, and the downright wicked. So that the church has always been a bit of a mess, even at its best, is only to be expected. It makes appeals on God's behalf precisely to those most conscious of their many moral weaknesses and failings. Despite the general mess and sometimes acts of evil, the church has been, I believe, to a far greater extent, a tremendous force for good in this world. Christians have cared for the poor and infirm and have historically been the greater part, by far, of movements to acknowledge the dignity and rights of children, women, and others who have been oppressed. Yes, some Christians have been on the wrong sides of some of these battles. Even where opponents of Christianity have helped spearhead related movements, as in Enlightenment Europe, their moral convictions have been profoundly shaped by Christian values. They've been more deeply Christian than the Christians around them. If you were raised in a deeply flawed Christian mini-environment, as some of you no doubt were, it will be hard for you to see the church's goodness. I have been able to experience, in tastes or more deeply, a pretty wide array of Christian communities, including a number in other countries. Yes, I sometimes see appalling stubbornness and stupidity. There are certain faces that come to mind, even as I say that, back at my own local church. But I also see, in greater measure, beauty and wisdom and sacrificial living. I've been personally nurtured in faith through the generous kindness and friendship of many. With humility, I hope, and much respect for the goodness plainly visible in people of other faiths and of none, many of whom I'm pleased to call my friends, I am persuaded of the following. If one surveys our globe, looking for a combination of historical and moral signs of a powerful and loving God's having instituted a reasonably cohesive community as the very human vehicle to reveal himself to all of us, then there is no better candidate than the Christian community. Thank you.
The remark about Jesus being the first feminist, that was new to me, but Plato was a feminist about 350 years before Jesus. So,
not as much as Jesus. Oh, okay, all right.
Anyway, so thank you very much to Tim, I guess I said, for his candid, vigorous presentation. And so I think mostly what I'm going to try to do is try to bring out how very vigorous some of his points were. I had the honor of knowing Tim when he was a graduate student at Cornell and I was an undergrad. And before I go on to do violence to his talk, I just want to say I have the highest respect for Tim as a person and a philosopher. I also knew his advisor at Cornell as a Norman Kretzmann, who I think is one of the greatest philosophers ever. And I just want to say that I think maybe the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Probably not a great metaphor for this audience, but there it is. In the interest of deferring to Tim and to getting, I want to hear from all of you. I'm going to try to keep my questions brief. And in the interest of truth in advertising, I should say right away that I can't address all or even most of his points. He sort of stuffed his remarks full of ideas. I'm just going to comment on a handful of them. I hope I'm getting at the more interesting ones, but I'm certain I'm not getting at all of them. So 8 questions. I hope you have a handout for me too. And on the back side, some things for further reading. 8 questions. If there's any sort of overarching aim to my questions, I guess I'm going to try to be more charitable to the other side. I think if I have one objection to Tim's presentation, it's that I think he didn't do as much for the rivalry as might be done. I think after Tim's remarks, we might wonder how there was ever any rivalry to begin with. So let's see. I've always thought that devil's advocate is an unfortunate term. But I guess that's sort of my role for tonight. So here we go. Question 1. To begin with, I'm puzzled by Tim's more straightforwardly historical remarks. He began with a few historical remarks, and several of these strike me as very strong and sort of odd. According to Tim, just about the only reason for thinking that there is, or ever has been, any tension between faith and reason is, as he puts it, a badly mistaken myth, one that has been thoroughly discredited by modern historians. As Tim explains it, the science-religion battle myth originated with some 18th century Enlightenment critics of Christianity and was cemented in polemical accounts of 19th century historians. I find this very puzzling. Anaxagoras might be too minor a figure to mention, but I'd have thought that Socrates would merit notice. He was tried and executed for impiety and corrupting the young, of course, but you suspect that his main means of corrupting was his alleged impiety. Furthermore, when we look at the pre-Socratics leading up to Socrates, we encounter a growing history of something at least very like naturalistic explanations supplanting or pushing out religious ones. It starts to look more and more like Poseidon's anger is not the best way to explain the stormy sea, and prayer is not the best way to navigate it. And throughout Hellenistic philosophy, we find the Epicureans and the Stoics constantly arguing about the role of God in explaining the natural world. Epicureans maintain that God is idle in those explanations, and the Stoics argue that God, and in particular providence, is everywhere vital to an adequate understanding. Still more puzzling is how little Tim has to say about medieval philosophy, where the interplay of faith and reason is a huge issue, probably the most dominant issue of the era. What Tim does say here is, Galileo was not tortured. And this itself is very strange to me. For one thing, I don't know whether or not Galileo was tortured is a good measure of the rivalry between faith and reason, the church and science. As far as I know, none of my good Chicago Cubbies have ever tortured any of the evil White Sox. But that doesn't mean the rivalry is not intense, right? Perhaps you say, well, look, they're playing the same game. And I say, not so fast. The White Sox use the designated hitter. And you say, well, look, that keeps the pitcher in the game longer. And I say, pitchers who can't bunt or run the bases are exactly the sort of hothouse flowers who are ruining sports. Right? So you say, well, look, at least the White Sox have won the World Series in the last century. If your Cubbies are so good, why don't they ever win? And I say, it's easy to love a winner. It takes a little faith to stand by your team through thick and thin, or in the Cubs' case, only thin. And besides that, maybe you've heard, our time is coming. The last shall be first. Back to the Middle Ages. The fact remains that throughout the medieval era in philosophy, the church positively exerted itself to shut down what was perceived to be threats from upstart science and reason. It might well be that Galileo was not tortured, having been merely encouraged to recant and then placed under house arrest. But in response to her promotion of pagan philosophy, Hypatia of Alexandria almost certainly was tortured and killed by a Christian mob in 415. In 448, Porphyry's anti-Christian writings were publicly burned. In 529, Justinian outlawed the teaching of pagan philosophy, and we should at least notice the condemnations of 1277, where the Bishop of Paris listed 219 conclusions that philosophers were not allowed to come to. It was 1633 when the Inquisition pressed Galileo to retract his support of Copernicus, which he did, but he did so in the shadow of, for example, the example made of Giordano Bruno, who was burned at the stake in 1600. According to one history, so heinous were his views that he was refused the usual courtesy of being garroted, strangled, before the fires were lit. Tim is probably right that the Catholic Church was the major funder of scientific inquiry from the late Middle Ages into the 18th century, and that many of the greatest thinkers in science and philosophy have been devout Christians. But I'm afraid these generalizations both obscure how much the Church dictated the conclusions to which its funded projects were allowed to come, and they leave us in the dark as to why Newton himself refused to publish his own work. He hid it in his desk. So much for my first question. Can it really be that the only motivation for the view that there's a long historical tension between religion and science is a badly mistaken myth, which has been thoroughly discredited by modern historians?
Thanks, Nathan. You know, I knew when he mentioned that he was a Chicago Cubs fan that we were not going to be seeing eye to eye on a lot of things tonight. Apparently, he grew up on the north side of Chicago. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. And when you grow up on the south side of Chicago, you're taught two things very early on. You love the White Sox, you despise the Cubs. Okay? You tolerated and they pitied Cub fans. You didn't hate the Cubs fans, but you despised the Cubs. And so you were schooled in irrational hatred from the get-go. I feel like I have a good understanding of what that's about, just from my relatively harmless indoctrination in White Sox stuff. But there we are. So you're a Cubs fan. All right, I got to take that into account. So I got to be patient. Go slow. All right, yeah. I accept a lot of what you're saying, but I don't draw the same conclusion that you do. That is a lot of the specific things that you point to. First of all, you go back to ancient Greek religion and the interaction with proto-scientific philosophy. I mean, one thing that Nathan knows well is there never was a thing called science and a thing called philosophy until maybe the 17th century. That is, there was something called natural philosophy, which was a mixture of what we would think of as philosophical sorts of explanations and reflections and attempts at empirical observation and systematization. And religion was bound up, of course, as in antiquity and long before that in human culture, with trying to explain natural phenomena. It's been a long, slow evolution, taken human beings a long, long time to disentangle what are distinctively religious ideas, what are distinctively philosophical ideas, and what would be science worthy of the name, right? So I was mainly speaking to the interaction of the Christian church. Right, I was focused on Christian faith and science. Yes, there are a number of, but what complicates a number of the cases that Nathan points to when we have the sort of medieval era and the hierarchical church are things like the fact that church and state are not sharply separated. There's a fusion of political power and religious power. The fact that some of the figures that are being suppressed and in some cases put to death are figures who are deemed to be religiously threatening. It's not so much narrowly scientific ideas as kind of a broader philosophical framework. Now, this doesn't excuse, it's deeply lamentable that church authorities chose to suppress those with opposing religious views, but this was an era where it was quite common in religious societies of all kinds to be highly intolerant of religious difference, right? Through all of that, right, it is, one other thing I wanted to say before I make my main point. I don't think it's an accurate depiction to say that the church was funding science as if it was saying, you're to come to these and these conclusions. I mean, part of the modern history of science has been to say science didn't just spring up out of nowhere in the 16th century with people like Galileo, right? There were precursors going back into the late medieval ages, as I'm sure Nathan knows. There was a lot of important work that kind of laid a conceptual foundation as the empirical method gets discovered and things really get up and going in the 16th and then the 17th century. So a lot of it had to do with how you went about doing what you did. I mean, Galileo is a great example. A big part of the reason why Galileo's work got suppressed was because he was an extremely vain and proud man, and he went out of his way to poke the Pope in the eye and even ridiculing him. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this myself, but I'm saying at that time, you do this, you get into trouble, right? It kind of in a veiled way in one of his dialogues, he has the Pope stand in as the kind of fool, the foil, right? And so he really irked the religious authorities in such a way that things didn't have to unfold the way they did with Galileo. And he continued to do scientific research in his villa for the rest of his life. And he was, at any rate, so that story is often misrepresented. And Galileo was part of the problem there, even though the response of the institutional church was by far the bigger part of the problem. But here's the thing that I would invite us all to think about. If it were true that the church was predominantly oppressive of attempts to engage in organized science that might not fit preconceived religious/scientific ideas about the cosmos, then why is it that it was in the heart of Christendom that we get the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, right? It would seem like if the story, the narrative that Nathan's sort of suggesting, I don't know if I'm interpreting him right, is right. It's really amazing. It's a great irony of history that the scientific revolution happened in the heart of Christian culture, rather than in the heart of Chinese culture, which had much longer and much more profound, 5 millennia, or in other parts of the world. So, I mean, that by itself should indicate that yes, there was a lot of heavy-handed oppression. And I'm no fan of hierarchical institutional forms of Christianity. I'll just lay my cards on the table. But a lot of free inquiry did take place, and it did eventually give rise to the scientific revolution and even the Enlightenment itself. I'll stop there. You can follow up if you like.
So it's not only a myth that is behind the idea that there's a rivalry.
The myth is that there's been this ongoing, continuous battle that we've had these religious figures just stamping out, where's it going on, stamp it out, ruthless, right? That there have been a number of episodes of institutional, authorities, religious authorities in Christendom, some of whom were among the most corrupt authorities in the history of Christendom. I mean, the High Middle Ages, by anyone's accounts, including Catholics, it's not a great era for pious religious leaders. But the idea that they were sort of continuously trying to suppress scientific inquiry that's a myth. There have been tensions, there have been flashpoints, right? But through those flashpoints and through some very ugly episodes, science was able to flourish and was permitted to flourish, and increasingly so as time went on.
Okay. As long as you didn't come to any of the 219 conclusions forbidden in 1277.
I should say something about that. Right, the Bishop of Paris, right, this is famous, because Thomas Aquinas is now revered by most Christian philosophers of all stripes, but especially by the Catholic Church. He's sort of the official philosopher. And only 3 years after Aquinas' death, some propositions that sounded an awful lot like paraphrases of things Aquinas himself said were among those things condemned. I believe it's true that 10 days after that condemnation was issued, the ceiling of the bishop's home fell on him and crushed him to death.
I'll be careful. Okay. Okay. So, question.
And just a few years later, Aquinas was named a saint. So these things come and go.
Okay. Question number 2. So my second question is about Tim's characterization of reason as rooted in a kind of trust, and similarly of the sciences as inevitably trust-based. Tim sets up the characterization here by first mentioning a sort of foil for his view. He says, many say reason look for evidence while faith takes things on trust. But this is not his view. This is the view he wants to expose as a false contrast. He explains how that contrast is false by appeal to reliance on journal reading in the sciences. He puts it as follows. Given the hyper-specialized nature of science, most of what a scientist knows, even in her own speciality, is based on what she reads in scholarly journals, not what she herself has independently verified. So it seems that there's an argument of analogy lurking just beneath the surface here. The argument seems to be this. In religion, we rely on things that we cannot independently verify and on the testimony of others, and it turns out to be the same in the sciences. We rely on things not independently verified and the testimony of others. Now, whenever we have an argument by analogy, the main question to ask is how similar are the cases being compared? In both religion and science, we need some starting points, something at least initially in which to put our trust. And in both cases, we rely on the testimony of others whose results we are not always in position independently to verify. But are these cases really alike? On reflection, I don't see that they're really much alike at all. For one thing, the fact that we have to start somewhere does not entail that all starting points are equally plausible. If I start with the hypothesis that heavy things fall faster than light ones, I have a pretty good idea of how to test that hypothesis, and in particular of what would count as evidence against it. If I start with the hypothesis that there's an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God, I have very little idea of what could count as evidence against it. As for relying on the testimony of others and what I might or might not be in position independently to verify, it seems to me there's a great deal of difference between, say, a belief that Japan exists, although I've never seen it, and a belief that angels exist or that Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. Again, when we rely on scholarly journals, we are relying on, for a start, important features of a shared methodology and of an idea of repeatability. When we read the Gospels, I don't see that a shared methodology, let alone a concern for repeatability, is at work. So in sum, my second question is just whether I have this right. Do we really want to say that science and religion both abide by some one same model of intellectual integrity? The question might be put in terms of evidentialism. It's a clunky term in philosophy for the view that it's irrational or unreasonable to believe anything on insufficient evidence. So, do we want to say that science and religion both equally adhere to evidentialism, or perhaps that neither do?
Okay, great. No, I wasn't trying to, I was trying to cram a lot in, as Nathan says, because I wanted to I feel like there's so many things swirling around this question of faith and reason. I adopted the strategy of hitting a lot of points and figuring Nathan would do his job at poking at them and wanting to get them developed further in discussion. So I wasn't trying to suggest that, religion and science are just alike. Of course, they're profoundly different in many ways. I was just trying to make the basic point that we do need to recognize that trust, calibrated, that's why I wanted to emphasize, calibrated trust that's sensitive to evidence and it's willing to revise our trusting opinions in the light of evidence, is pervasive. It's something we all do. It's something even in organized science. It's right at the heart of our knowledge. And I think that's simply true, right? But now, in the case of religious faith, you can't say in religion because there are different religious people. Some religious people, including some religious Christians, are deeply unreasonable in the way they form or maintain their beliefs or the way they respond to evidence. I think others are quite reasonable. So I was offering a model for what reasonable Christian faith is that I believe many people instantiate, but not all, right? And that model is that we do take ourselves to have evidence that God exists and that God is seeking to communicate to us. And ultimately, we think we have evidence that the person Jesus of Nazareth was who he said he was and who his followers later claimed him to be. We don't have conclusive evidence for that in the sense of beyond all possibility of rational doubt. But there is significant evidence, And it's mediated for an individual. It comes to be a question of a relationship. One takes oneself to be in a relationship with a being God, and one takes to exist. So you go from there, and then you sift evidence. And part of what I wanted to do in drawing the analogy between science and religious faith is that both are deeply communal. That was the commonality. Both involve certain kinds of trust. Both are deeply communal. That is, it's not just me and Jesus. Sorry, for those of you who like to think in those terms. And that is, I can't even coherently have beliefs about Jesus without being deeply dependent on the scholarship of a variety of individuals who can give me reason to believe that these texts are giving me some accurate depiction of an historical individual who actually lived and died in roughly the way that the Gospels depict, and a variety of other sources of other forms of authority, that intellectual authority, who have skills that I don't have, right? So in coming to trust in the gospel claims as a Christian, I am either explicitly or implicitly coming to trust that a certain community, it's a distributed community, it's not nearly as tightly organized, it's an egalitarian community, right? It's not an intellectually elitist community in the way science is, so it's got a lot of noise mixed in with what you take to be the signal, right? But that's your understanding of God and of Christ, if you're a Christian, is mediated through that community, right? And that's what I wanted to say. And I wanted to say that, and it is true for an individual scientist, that at the end of the day, yes, they take there to be these communities that are, we all take there to be well-organized communities that have correcting procedures and so on. But ultimately, we're trusting in our senses, we're trusting in the testimony of others that they're really doing what they say they're doing, right? And so just part of, I guess I was trying to push back against this idea of reason that we've had ever since the Enlightenment, that almost every major, including some of my philosophical heroes like Leibniz, have, Descartes being a chief example of this, have wanted to emphasize the solitary thinker, figuring things out for him or herself, right? Thomas Reid is like the only major figure of the era, of the 17th and 18th century, who points out, hey, just about everything that we believe because other people have told us this, right? It's as if nobody else in the 17th and 18th century sort of noted this obvious truth. It is an obvious truth, and it's a deeply important one. And so I just wanted to sort of lay out that marker. So when you think about the rationality of religious belief, you're saying, okay, here's this individual embedded in this social context. They take themselves to have certain kinds of evidence, and where do they go from there? Whether they're reasonable or not depends on where they go from there, right, in the way they sift evidence. Now, for Nathan and me, right, if for either of us to be reasonable in our religious or non-religious beliefs, the bar is much higher given the exposure to evidence that we've had, the training and education, our ability to access scholarly sources and know how to make our way around and look for evidence. Some peasant farmer off in some, Christian community that has no exposure to other religious traditions, for whom, the pastor is the only educated person in the community, is in a very, very different epistemic situation. The standards of rationality for that person are very different. So, I don't know, that was a kind of a rambling answer. Is there something very focal that I haven't hit on?
I think I'm going to let that
okay.
go. I don't think you stepped up to the plate on evidentialism.
Oh, yeah. So I do want to say that reasonable faith is grounded in evidence, right? I don't want to endorse a conception of faith that says, oh, faith is special. Faith doesn't need evidence. Faith is, and maybe you want to pick up on that.
My third question is about Tim's characterization of faith as reasoned trust. He puts it this way, seems to be very striking. Christian faith is reasoned trust in what one takes to be God's self-revelation and promises to humankind. It's individual, but it's also pervasively mediated by the life of the Christian community as a whole. We take ourselves to have evidence that we are in a relationship with a being who cares deeply for us and has communicated his love to us. At some point, we commit in trust, not unlike the way a person goes all in on a relationship with another human person whose trustworthiness is indicated by evidence but is not proved. So Tim conceives of faith as grounded in evidence. To be sure, he suggests that this evidence falls short of proof, but he seems to take it that the evidence suffices to make faith eminently reasonable. And again, he has an analogy, which I think is interesting and should be questioned. He compares faith in God to faith in a friend or perhaps a spouse. I'm going to leave that analogy aside for now. Maybe we can talk about it in discussion. Just here, the point that seems to be more striking is how very cognitive Tim's picture of faith is and how very different it is from other Christian accounts of faith. Tim seems to see faith as confidence or maybe courage bolstered by evidence, but others have seen it as importantly otherwise. So let me give one example. Consider this passage from Kierkegaard. If I'm capable of grasping God objectively, I do not believe. But precisely because I cannot do this, I must believe. If I wish to preserve myself in faith, I must constantly be intent upon holding fast to the objective uncertainty so as to remain out upon the deep over 70,000 fathoms of water, still preserving my faith. In this passage, we see a very different idea of faith than the one that Tim is, I think, relying on. And I will just say that I think this idea of faith is embraced more widely than by Kierkegaard. This is the idea of faith that is at the heart of what we might call fideism. Now, fideism is the view, roughly, that it's permissible or even meritorious to believe at least some religious doctrines in the absence of sufficient evidence. Right? It might be a virtue to believe it because you don't have evidence for it. And fideism can claim a number of prominent Christian adherents. Kierkegaard, Tertullian, William of Ockham, probably Augustine, to name just a few. If we read between the lines in Tim's remarks here this evening, it seems to me that he wants to stake out a non-fideist position. However, without quite saying that fideism is anathema to his views, but I should not like to read too much between the lines, let alone to put words in his mouth. Thus, my third question is just this. Why not fideism?
Right, yeah. So Kierkegaard's view, Søren Kierkegaard was a interesting, complicated, moody, brooding Danish philosopher of the 19th century. Brilliant writer, and for that reason, many people like to read him. Less beloved of philosophers because he's not terribly systematic in the way he goes about things, not super clear. But yeah, Kierkegaard does paint this extreme view of faith, that faith is all the better, that we should have no evidence whatsoever, because then it makes our faith be not reliant on anything, you know, all those pawnbrokers of trust and so forth, just, you know, throwing myself into the abyss. We should not believe that because it's irrational. And it's an abuse of the gift of reason that God, our Creator, has given us. It is not the dominant view of Christian faith in the Christian tradition. Sure, you can find many sort of pious Christians who may, especially when they're cornered and they don't feel like they have very good arguments and they're being pressured by someone very educated and smart like Nathan, maybe they'll retreat and they'll start saying, well, it's faith, you know, fideism. But I don't even think this is the ordinary way, the way the ordinary religious person thinks about it day to day. The idea that we believe things because that we have faith in things that we cannot ourselves verify, or maybe even that we can't understand. That's common to the Christian tradition, right? The doctrine of the Trinity, the doctrine of the Incarnation. These are, I don't know if I should explain these things, right? I think you all understand the basic ideas. I've thought about these issues very hard, and I have the most tenuous grasp on what those doctrines are exactly claiming, right? But I can believe that something is true that I don't well understand. I can have reason to think something is true that I don't well understand. I think there's good models for this actually in 20th century science. We don't really understand the most successful theory in the history of science, which is quantum mechanics. We don't have a clear grasp on exactly what it's saying about reality, but we have very good, overwhelming evidence that it is tracking truth, right? And I think something like that is going on in the case of Christianity. The best interpretation, I would say, of the phenomena that is the person Jesus of Nazareth is that he was manifestly human, and that he was also divine. And Christian doctrine tries to encapsulate that in formulas, but it doesn't pretend to really understand how that could be exactly. But I can have reason to think something is so even though I don't understand it, okay? Kierkegaard's view is very extreme. Tertullian, it's true, in the early 3rd century, so we're going from the 19th to the early 3rd century, Tertullian had an extreme view. I believe it because it's absurd. The Son of God died, I believe it because it's impossible. It's just crazy talk. And you won't find a lot of church fathers with that. He's the most extreme of the early church fathers. But I won't give you Augustine. Oh my goodness, right? Augustine was a great champion of reason. He was a bishop, right? And the most influential theologian of the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages, and then on through the history of Christendom. And Augustine regularly exhorted his congregants not to abuse reason, not to go. Augustine, in fact, strongly chastised Christians who claimed that revelation told them certain things about the natural world that were at odds with what the scientists of the day had to say. He said, in doing so, you bring the faith into disrepute, right? And he said not to try to give an account, a rational account of your faith is to abuse the gift. I was looking for the passage that I had with the Augustine quote. So, no, I think that has been more the dominant official position, right? What individual Christians do, that's a highly variable matter. We're talking about billions of people. So what I was giving was a normative account, right? This is what faith ought to be, what it can be, and what I think it is for many people.
My 4th question is also aimed at getting clearer about what exactly Tim's views are. Thank you for that. What I have in mind here is, on the one hand, the emphasis he gives to, as he puts it, the fundamental orderliness of the universe, but then on the other hand, he never quite says that he endorses an argument from design. Again and again, Tim appeals to a number and a variety of, in his words, apparently arbitrary, highly precise features of the universe, such that had any one of them differed appreciably, the universe would not have evolved in a way consistent with the appearance of biological life. The strength and weakness of various nuclear forces, the proton-electron ratio, etc., etc. He takes this as evidence that the universe is especially well calibrated for us to thrive in. Contemporary physics has come to learn that our universe is remarkably fine-tuned for life, and hence for sentient life and other animal life that has great value. All this sounds to me most reminiscent of Cleanthes in Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. Cleanthes is setting out an argument from design. He says, look at the world. It's exquisitely adapted to us to thrive in. Now, I'm sure that Tim is more familiar with the ins and outs of arguments from design than I am, but given the similarity of his arguments to this kind of argument, I can't help but wonder why he doesn't use the terms. Maybe the trouble here is just the terms, argument from design, have now been so bandied about that they drag in with them any number of stock objections. However that may be, to the extent that Tim appeals to the fundamental orderliness of the universe, he seems to me to invite at least a question as to what sort of designer this evidence really points to. It seems to me, as maybe it does to Philo, the skeptic in Hume's dialogues, that the evidence of design here vastly underdetermines the precise character of the designer. To sum up my 4th question, based on the evidence of the order we find in the world, why should we conclude that the Creator is God, or indeed a Christian God, rather than not some more random God on acid? Right? I mean, just look at the Northern Lights, right?
Great. Yes, it is. Yes, because I was taking myself not to be talking to an audience of philosophy majors, I didn't bandy about terms like argument from design. But yes, it is an argument from design, but it's not an argument by analogy. I think that's Hume's way of thinking about these design arguments in particular is the wrong way to think about it. We should think about it in terms of the way we think about confirming theories in science, right? bits of evidence either up or decrease or perhaps are neutral with respect to a theory. The prospects of a theory like stock go up and down on the basis of various kinds of evidence that you consider. And there are ways you try to assess it. And a major factor in assessing evidence is how likely is what we observe given the hypothesis. How likely would it be that we should observe that if the hypothesis were false? And you consider the ratio of those two things. You can do this in a kind of technical, formal way. So argument from design is just one piece of evidence, right? I take it that it's indicative of that our universe has an intelligent, powerful source. Don't think when I say that, capital I, capital D, intelligent design. I'm not saying that, all right, in biology, okay? I'm not saying that at all. So now, but well, why think it's a an individual God rather than, Hume says, why not a committee of deities or maybe a baby deity, this sort of thing. Hume says there's all kinds of hypotheses we could consider. Well, one thing we know about our universe that Hume didn't know back in the 18th century is how extraordinarily unified our universe is. It's very, very old. It's much bigger than Hume could have imagined, anybody could have imagined prior to the 20th century, and yet it has a deep origin back, going back in time, 13.7, now they say 13.8 billion years old, right? It's deeply unified by fundamental principles. So, a kind of polytheistic community of intelligent beings is a far less probable interpretation of what we have than the idea of a single designer. Well, why not, why the Christian God? Well, this says nothing about Christianity at all. It's an argument indicative in the direction of theism, right? But why think the being has moral properties? Well, it's not going to be because the universe is fine-tuned for life, but it might be because we believe, are committed to the existence of objective moral value. Given that increases the likelihood, right? Now the hypothesis that the designer is the source of moral value, right, rather than being some acid tripping, kind of being, has been increased. So different parts of evidence can work together in a cumulative case. It's wrong to think of the argument design as classically philosophical arguments. There's this argument for God. All right, evaluate. Good or bad? Decide. All right, now here's another argument for the existence of God. Design argument. Good, bad, decide. Right? A better way to think is to think of these arguments as potentially mutually reinforcing. Right? And there might be other, and offering evidence that when taken in conjunction with one another, point in a more focused, specific direction. That's the suggestion. Of course, you might take the argument from evil, the presence of widespread suffering, to be evidence that pushes the other way. We can talk about that, right? But that's the proper way I see it to evaluate these kind of considerations, is to weigh a whole bunch of things together. I think that's about all I wanted to say about that.
Yep. Let me have the last one.
So I know that some of you are on the verge of turning into a pumpkin. So let me remind you of the fact that we do have refreshments. If you can stay awake long enough. They're in the back. Nathan did ask to ask one more question. I'm going to let him do that. So we'll have one more exchange before we let you go. And then the other thing is I've been asked to remind you to fill out that response card. And I guess when you fill it out, pass it one way or another, and I think there will be some people walking up and down the aisles that can collect it.
Have we used up all their Q&A time?
We have. And the last thing to say is, so far Nathan and Tim are not pumpkins, so if you want to stick around afterwards, you might have to choose between food at the back or truth at the front. But if you're willing to make that kind of choice, feel free to come up here and join into the informal conversation following the presentation. Thank you very much for persisting as long as you have. But one more question from Nathan before we finish.
So I'm going to skip over 5, 6, and 7 and go to 8, which I think is the one Tim's most ready to answer, and indeed I think is probably the hardest question. It's a little painful, but here it is. So Tim flags this as a topic he wants to talk about, and I just want to try to sharpen up the question a little bit. So he says in one place, widespread, intense, unjust, seemingly random human and animal suffering is hard to square with the existence of a benevolent, all-powerful creator. But then he says in another place that all of reality is the good creation of God. All of reality is the good creation of God. And then He trusts that God will ultimately redeem it, all of it. So it's clear that Tim is eager to speak to the question of why or how to square the suffering in the world with the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing God, and I want to know what he has to say. But let me make a little requirement on the shape of the question. Here's two different questions. One question we might call, to borrow a phrase of Tim's, the intellectual problem of suffering. This is the question of how there could be any suffering at all. Isn't an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God, isn't it weird that he would let even one child suffer? Well, maybe there is an answer to that question. Maybe there's some greater good that would not be possible without some suffering. Maybe the cultivation of compassion would go some ways towards explaining why some suffering might be necessary. However, there's another question, which we might call the evidential question. This is the question of why there is so very much suffering in the world. And immediately some will want to point to free will as the source of suffering. On reflection, I fail to see how that's an adequate defense. Consider the tsunami in the Indian Ocean, December 26, 2004. In one day, 150,000 people dead, millions more homeless and broken. The earthquake in Kashmir, October 8, 2005, another 100,000 dead in a day. The children were at school, and most of them were buried under their collapsed school buildings. This is beyond horrible. According to the World Health Organization, about 800,000 children die each year from just diarrhea, mostly just because they lack clean drinking water. So in the last decade, that amounts to 8 million children. It's worth taking a moment to try to take the weight of that number. It's staggering. I mean, and so far beyond appalling as to boggle the mind. Try, put it in, 8 million children dead from lack of clean drinking water. So much for my last question. I'm very puzzled by the idea that somehow the suffering of this world might be redeemed in another world. I don't know how that works. But I'm even more puzzled by how it can be that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, and there's so very much and such intense suffering of our dearest possessions, our babies, our children. When we take stock of these figures, I don't know how we can say all of reality is the good creation of God. Myself, I find it too debilitating to try to say that all this suffering is somehow part of a greater good. But I'm eager to hear what Tim has to say.
All right, thanks. So I'll start off by saying I don't have an answer. I don't think anyone else does either, and it's not for lack of trying. People, not just Christians, but people in all religious cultures in human history have struggled with this question. And Nathan he gave a pretty impassioned, impressive speech that sort of noted just the weight of horrific suffering, some of the weight of horrific suffering that we know exists in our world. I'm sobered by that. Any morally sensitive person is the natural inclination is to not want to say anything at all. But that said, an impressive speech is not an argument. Okay, so we need to, if we're asking about an evidential argument, we have to say, does suffering provide decisive or heavy disconfirmation for theism? Right? It can seem so. But let's think about how that argument might go, because Nathan didn't actually. This is very, very common when people talk about the problem of what philosophers call the problem of evil, what you might think of the problem of suffering. People give a long litany of some of the horrors that are true of our world, and they say, "What about that?" Right? That's not an argument. That's not an argument with premise, therefore probably God does not exist. So we should think about, right? Go through the exercise of saying, what would the argument look like? Well, I think it would go something like this. There is horrendous evil in our world that probably cannot have redemptive value that outweighs its intrinsic badness. We could fuss about how we formulate that premise, but something like that is going to be an important premise. Second premise, if an all-knowing, all-powerful, omnibenevolent God exists, he would permit horrendous evils only if there were some outweighing good for which they were absolutely necessary. Something like that, right? So from those two premises, it follows probably God does not exist. But why think the first premise is true? Remember, the first premise is there is horrendous evil that probably, I put in probably to make, it's easy to poke at, just say probably, that's strong enough for the argument to go through. There is horrendous evil that probably cannot have redemptive value that outweighs, cannot lead to redemptive value that outweighs its intrinsic goodness. Well, the reason we are tempted to think one is true is because we look for a reason, we think about it, we ask other people, we read tomes on the question, and we don't find one, right? No one, right? We can talk about human free will, necessary for moral responsibility. That means, God has introduced a wild card into creation, and humans might abuse the gift of free will they've been given. But that, okay, free will. So I might be able to hurt someone else's feelings, but why should God allow me to slaughter someone, right? Isn't that allowing, that's giving me too much of a leash. Right, so those kinds of answers are intuitively unsatisfying. But consider two analogous statements. I look in my refrigerator, scan the shelves, and sadly, I say, I can't find any beer in here. Okay, that's one case. Second case, I look out my back window. I'm told about slugs, tiny little bugs that crawl around in the grass. There's grass is growing long in my backyard. I look out my back window, and I look around, and I say, I can't see any slugs here, right? Probably there are no slugs, right? In one case, I conclude probably there's no beer here, right? At least if I'm not, doing it at 2 a.m. or something after I've already had a lot of beer, then it might not be so reliable, right? But under ordinary circumstances, if I look around, sometimes people miss what's right in front of their eyes. It's very probable that if a beer bottle were in the refrigerator, it's not too crowded, I would have seen it. So the fact that I didn't see it is indicative that it's probably not there. But when I look out my back window for slugs crawling around in the grass and I don't see them, that is not an indication that there are not slugs. The lawn could be teeming with slugs, and it might not seem to me that there are there. So which of these two cases is more analogous to the case when I try to figure out what would be the reasons that an omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent being would have for permitting horrific sufferings of the form that Nathan points to? And we could think of even worse cases of suffering, I think, than the sorts that he talked about. Right? Okay, so I say, right, play God, or try to get inside imagine I'm God. I'm sort of looking out, I have trouble thinking about what happens in my local community for a week and trying to keep track of all the morally relevant features of what's going on. Think of the whole of human, span of human history. If there's an afterlife, and that's absolutely critical to there being an answer to the problem of evil, right? Because we know for a fact that a lot of suffering is not redeemed in this life. We know that. We have direct, overwhelming empirical evidence for that, right? So now, what kind of reality could God bring about? How could God so transform and heal and restore human beings so that some of the most intense sufferings that they experienced in this life could ultimately turn out to have redemptive significance for them, right? I'm at sea trying to I have a very limited imagination, right? I don't know what kinds of goods there are, maybe, that could be integrally connected to undergoing intense suffering of different kinds, right? I'm not a moral skeptic. I think I know about what a lot of goods that there are for human beings. Having intimate friendships, being nurtured in a loving home, right? Being able to cultivate the gifts and abilities one has in a satisfying way so that one's life has deep significance for one. On the good side. On the bad side, suffering intense physical, psychological, emotional pain. These are bad things, right? I'm not denying that we know these things, right? The question is, do we know about other goods, right? Kinds of moral goods that there might be that are connected to this. We're not in a position, I want to say. It's kind of like, to use another analogy, if I'm playing chess against a chess grandmaster, I'm a decent chess player, I'm not a great chess player, right? And that chess player sticks his queen out in the center of the chessboard, right, in a way that's exposed, the queen being the most valuable piece, offensive piece on the board, where I can take it and not even suffer a consequence. It looks to me like a colossal blunder right? But if I'm playing against a chess grandmaster, right, I realize I'm out of my depth. A chess grandmaster, part of what makes them so good is they can visualize the board 6, 7 moves out. And maybe he's very subtly drawing some piece of mine out of position if I take the bait, such that ultimately he can checkmate me, right? I just can't tell. I'm not good enough. I don't have the ability to see the space of possibilities in order to be able to discern that. I want to say, when it comes to the facts of human suffering, we're just not in a position to say. Therefore, right, it neither confirms nor disconfirms the suffering, the existence of God. It might be that there is, in conceptual space, there is no good reason that an omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent being could have for permitting intense human suffering. It might be. We're just not in a position to judge whether that is so or not, even as a matter of probability. I take it. Now, Nathan, so that's what I want to say about the sort of evidential problem of evil. Nathan also points to a kind of more existential kind of problem, right? We viscerally react to some of the most horrible kinds of suffering in the world, right? Dostoevsky, the Christian, Russian Orthodox Christian writer of the 19th century, expresses this well through one of his antagonist characters, Ivan, in The Brothers Karamazov, right? Ivan, he becomes an atheist, right? He's talking to his pious brother, and he says, even if there is some grand scheme where it all makes sense, I don't want to be a part of that. There's a kind of moral outrage saying, I don't want to be party to that, right? I can't, what he seems to be saying is it's not an intellectual puzzle, right? He's seeming to be saying, I can't integrate the thought that there is redemptive value to some suffering with my moral sort of solidarity with those who suffer, right? And that's not an intellectual argument, but it can be it's a kind of thing that can alienate you from theistic belief in a purely psychological way. And I just want to say that Dostoevsky's own answer is kind of complicated through this mystical priest character, Father Zosima. I won't tell you about what Dostoevsky says about that, but I'll say that as a Christian, that kind of existential problem is greatly mitigated for me by the belief that God himself took on human suffering, experienced intense suffering. Right? God doesn't call me just to trust. I've got it figured out. You can't see it. Sorry, someday you will, but for now you don't. God identified with us in our suffering, right? This is not an intellectual argument that somehow solves, as I said in my opening remarks, the problem of evil as an intellectual puzzle, but it does address the existential problem of pain, I think.
I just want to say thank you. And I know many of you have exams tomorrow and homework to do. Thank you so much for coming out and bearing with us.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.